In the late 1990s, legendary filmmaker Billy Wilder sat down with Cameron Crowe for a series of interviews. If you don't know who Billy Wilder is, he's the writer-director behind classics like Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and Some Like It Hot, among many, many, many others. And if you don't know who Cameron Crowe is, he made Aloha.
Well, I remember the good times. There were no good times!
Anyway, one of the more interesting gems to come from their discussions is Wilder's Tips for Writers, a list of 11 screenwriting principles. It's a perfectly helpful guide in its own right, but I think we gain the most by actively applying these principles to Wilder's own work. So that's what we're going to do today. Apply each of Wilder's tips to what Wilder himself considered to be his best film, The Apartment, co-written by I.A.L. Diamond. The goal here is not to valorize Wilder's list as some sort of foolproof screenwriting formula, but to see the benefits of these principles when they're put into action. 2 quick disclaimers. First, this video is full of spoilers, not just in terms of plot and character, but also a lot of the tiny details which really help make the screenplay. So if you haven't seen The Apartment, go ahead and add this video to your watch later pile and go watch the film. The Apartment is a true joy of filmmaking that's worth experiencing on its own terms first. Just remember to like and subscribe before you go. Alright, second disclaimer, not only am I not a screenwriter, but I also don't know how to read, so you should take any advice I have with a grain of salt. The audience is fickle. When Wilder says this, he's talking about trend surfing. Fads come and go, and aren't really worth chasing. It's better to stick to core storytelling fundamentals. This holds true for The Apartment, which is in many ways a very traditional story. For its time, the film was also very modern and adult in its treatment of material like adultery and depression. But it's still a classic love story about 2 people who find each other and grow to be better. That's the kind of timeless story that transcends any era, and is a big part of why The Apartment still holds up. However, I think there's a second lesson to be found here. If you listen to Wilder, he talks a lot about how audiences will turn on a film if the script is too shallow or poorly structured. It's not enough to rest on a high concept, or a good character, or sharp dialogue. Your screenplay needs to be more layered, and this tracks with The Apartment. The film does have an ingenious high concept. An office worker loans his apartment to his bosses so they may conduct their affairs, and in return, he moves quickly up the company ladder. It's easy to imagine a wacky sex comedy from this premise, but it's actually a relatively small part of The Apartment. The premise is really just a jumping off point, as the screenplay continuously builds and expands on the idea. What starts as a seemingly comical high concept becomes tragic when we see the consequences of these affairs. But romance sparks as our leads come together, and the film eventually becomes aspirational as we watch both heroes grow better. By the time you get to the end, you aren't really thinking about the high concept, you're just wrapped up in these characters' lives. So the film doesn't just rest on any one element. The high concept yields an ever-evolving story, centered on complex characters with clear arcs. In turn, the film becomes more than just a premise, but a fully enveloping story. But how do Wilder and Diamond actually do it? How do they structure their screenplay to keep the fickle audience engaged? The answers lie in the rest of Wilder's list, which at its core is precisely about keeping a fickle audience hooked. Grab them by the throat and never let them go. The message here is pretty self-explanatory, but how do Wilder and Diamond actually go about this? It's useful to take a look at the film's opening. Following the credits, The Apartment's opening scene lasts 8 pages, starting with the insurance building the characters work at, and ending with the protagonist's unfulfilling TV dinner. This scene does a lot. First and foremost, it introduces main character C.C. Baxter. In terms of hooking the audience, Wilder and Diamond quickly establish Baxter as someone with an endearing and likable personality, but also demonstrates a very relatable sense of loneliness and isolation. At this point, the audience not only clearly has a sense of who Bud is, but hopefully empathizes with him too. Crucial too, this opening introduces the film's juicy high concept, that Baxter is loaning his apartment to his adulterous superiors. Rather than merely explaining this to the audience, Wilder and Diamond show us both its comic potential.
Why'd all you dames have to live in the Bronx?
You mean you bring other girls up here?
Certainly not. I'm a happily married man.
And dramatic, as it intrudes on Baxter's life twice. This opening also packs a ton of information that will inform the rest of the film, including the 2 key settings of the story, major supporting characters, and even alludes to the film's principal antagonist.
Look, kid, I put in a good word for you with Sheldrake and personnel.
Mr. Sheldrake?
We were discussing our department, manpower-wise, promotion-wise. I told him what a bright boy you are.
These lines, and the scenario more broadly, also begin to explore the core conflict of the film, Baxter's willingness to subordinate himself for professional advancement. But for all this opening establishes, Wilder and Diamond are careful not to give us everything up front. Most crucially, we get no mention of secondary main character Miss Kubelik, or the love triangle between she, Baxter, and Sheldrake that will drive the drama of the apartment. By withholding this information, the audience still has new things to discover. Develop a clear line of action for your leading character. Another thing the film's opening does is clearly outline Baxter's want versus need. In screenwriting terms, want refers to the external thing which motivates a character's actions, while need refers to the internal change a character must undergo. Shrek's want is for the fairy tale creatures to fuck off from his swamp, which motivates his quest to save Fiona. But his need is to open himself up to others, accomplished by his burgeoning friendship with Donkey and eventual romance with Fiona. Spoilers for Shrek, I guess. Baxter's want is professional advancement. This is plainly outlined in the film's opening and implicitly explains why Baxter allows himself to be taken advantage of and engage in morally dubious behavior of his own. And indeed, Baxter does see professional advancement throughout the film, eventually moving all the way up to assistant director. Baxter's need, on the other hand, is not to find love and win over Miss Kubelik, but to stand up for himself and stop being a shit. As the doc says, to become a mensch, a real human being. This need is fueled precisely by Baxter's want. Baxter's desire for professional advancement is why he lets himself be taken advantage of. It is only by rejecting his want that Baxter can actually fulfill his need. Linking want and need in this way enhances the drama, as it forces the character to sacrifice something in order to grow. But Baxter's need is not only to stand up for himself, but also to stop his own harmful actions. See, Baxter may let himself be taken, but he also allows and enables the cruelty and exploitation of others. He lets married men use his apartment to cheat on their wives and take advantage of younger women, and he also refuses to challenge the sexism of his superiors. He may not join in, and he may personally disapprove, but Baxter is still complicit in a system of exploitation. But as Baxter spends time with Miss Kubelik and sees the harm he's helped facilitate, he begins to change, outright denying his superiors, culminating with Sheldrake himself. Baxter's refusal to give Sheldrake the key to his apartment is inspired by Baxter's own love for Miss Kubelik, yes, but it's also because he no longer wants to participate in this sexist, dehumanizing culture. And this sense of atoning for one's own mistakes and standing against exploitation is why the film can't just end with Baxter hooking up with Miss Kubelik. Baxter's central flaw established in the opening scene isn't that he doesn't have a girlfriend, or even a more general sense of loneliness, but that he's a pushover enabling a cycle of exploitation. The pivotal moment of growth is not getting the girl, it's disrupting that cycle. This arc is mirrored in Miss Kubelik. Miss Kubelik may not aid in the exploitation of others the same way Baxter does, but she too is led along by false promises while being exploited by cads like Sheldrake. Miss Kubelik's want is for Sheldrake to divorce his wife and be with her instead, but her need is to find the self-confidence to stand up for herself. Her moment of growth isn't finding a better boyfriend, it's finding the strength to leave Sheldrake. She and Baxter help each other through their mutual kindness, and it's that kindness which inspires their growth. Both characters are defined by their weaknesses, as people who get took.
Some people take, some people get took. And they know they're getting took, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Wilder and Diamond draw a clear line from there to people who won't let themselves be taken anymore. Know where you're going. This tip is about setup and payoff. The central principle of setup and payoff is the notion that narrative elements are more emotionally satisfying when they are actively planted beforehand. In other words, things in a movie don't just happen at random, but are established earlier in the story, and return later in a way which makes some sort of sense. The gin game is first established as one of Baxter's efforts to distract Miss Kubelik from the pain in her life, but later returns as a way for the pair to profess their love to each other. Setup and payoff. We even get a reminder at the beginning of Act 3.
You know, we never did finish that gin game.
I know.
With that in mind, let's talk about the climax to The Apartment. The Apartment's climax seems like your standard rom-com finale, with Miss Kubelik running back to Baxter. But as she nears his apartment, we fear the worst. But then the punchline hits. This is a fine gag in its own right, but it's the build-up that really makes it sing. Every detail here is precisely set up earlier in the screenplay. Baxter tells Miss Kubelik about his own suicide attempt 20 pages earlier.
I went through exactly the same thing myself.
You did?
Yeah, well, maybe not exactly the same. I tried to do it with a gun.
Over a girl?
Worse than that, it was the wife of my best friend. You know where I finally shot myself?
Where?
Here.
In the knee?
Later, as Baxter is packing, he finds his gun, reminding the audience of its presence and establishing he still has it in the apartment. Then, Dr. Dreyfus visits and invites Baxter to join his party. Baxter refuses, claiming he has some things to do and is going somewhere unspecified, but not before unsuccessfully offering Dreyfus a bottle of champagne. At this point, all of the pieces are in place. The suicide story sets up the premise. The gun and champagne bottle are both established in Baxter's apartment, and Baxter's vague dialogue implies he may be contemplating suicide. Consequently, this joke is all the more powerful, with the punchline prompting feelings of both relief and recognition.
Are you all right?
I'm fine.
The laughs come from how the scene pays off several details of build-up.
How's your knee?
I'm fine all over.
The whole thing just feels very natural, but that doesn't just happen by accident. Wilder and Diamond knew where they were going, and their focused screenplay precisely brings us to this point. But it's not enough to know where you're going, particularly if your setups are obvious and contrived. And that brings us to, the more subtle and elegant you are in hiding your plot points, the better you are as a writer. All stories are made up of certain beats, but when the audience can consciously recognize the story beats, they realize they're watching an artificial construction. But if you can hide these plot points, Wilder believed you deepen the illusion of the movie, as the audience slowly becomes lost in the storytelling. How do you actually hide your plot points? Well, the same way a magician hides their tricks, for one: misdirection. Distract the audience with something else while hitting your plot points. Consider the origin of how Baxter started loaning his apartment. It started innocently enough, with Baxter loaning his apartment to a co-worker so they could change for a banquet. And once word got out, his bosses began pouring in with requests they take their mistresses there. Wilder and Diamond could have made this the prologue of the film, or even had Baxter describe it in the opening voiceover. But instead, this origin story has slipped into Baxter's first meeting with Sheldrake. Within this scene, both Baxter and the audience are led to believe that Sheldrake is reprimanding Baxter for his actions. And that creates a lot of tension. Is Baxter about to be punished? How's he going to get out of this situation? His story of how he started leasing his apartment becomes a sort of verbal tool in Baxter's exchange with Sheldrake. It still conveys the same information, how Baxter's lack of conviction led to his bosses using him and his apartment. But the audience is so focused on the tension of the scene, they don't notice they're being fed plot information. Another way to hide the plot point is through detail. Baxter's story isn't just an explanation for a plot point, it's also loaded with detail.
About a year ago, I was going to night school. I was taking this course in advanced accounting. One of the guys in our department, lives in Jersey, had to go to a banquet at the Biltmore. His wife was beating him in town. He needed some place to change into a tuxedos.
This all helps explain why Baxter didn't need the apartment that night, and why his coworker couldn't change at home. But more importantly, this level of detail helps flesh out this plot point. It helps it feel real. Wilder and Diamond do this throughout the apartment.
I went to a pawn shop and I bought a .45 automatic and I drove up to Eaton Park. You know Cincinnati?
Some clown at Trash 57th Street ate a club sandwich and forgot to take out the toothpick.
His name was George, and he threw me over for a drum majorette. I came to New York and moved in with my sister and her husband. He drives a cab. But I flunked the typing test.
Too slow?
No, I can type up a story. I just can't spell.
Rarely do these details play an active role in shaping the plot or characters, but that doesn't matter. What does matter is that these details help breathe life and personality into the screenplay. Consequently, the audience doesn't see the plot points, they just see the story. The final way Wilder and Diamond hide their plot points relates to setup and payoff. We've discussed already how nothing in the apartment happens at random. Virtually every major development and gag in the story is set up in advance, and yet the film always feels spontaneous. And that's because Wilder and Diamond load their setups with immediate value and purpose. And in turn, the audience doesn't feel like they're being set up, and the payoff is still surprising. Baxter's suicide story is a setup for the film's climax, but it's also a funny story in its own right, one which refers to the core themes of the film and the tension between self-destruction and self-improvement. This scene is also a pivotal moment in bringing Baxter and Miss Kubelik closer together. The setup has value in and of itself. Wilder credited this sort of storytelling to writer-director Ernst Lubitsch, and referred to this setup payoff structure as the super joke. The joke that was funny the first time, but leads to an even funnier joke later on. It's funny when this happens.
How many drinks did you have?
3!
I thought so.
But it's even funnier when this happens.
Well, how many guys were there?
3.
The trick is that the audience doesn't see the second joke coming. My favorite example of this is the key. It's established very early on that the key to Baxter's apartment looks nearly identical to the key to the executive washroom. The audience is reminded of this when Baxter is promoted and granted access to the executive washroom, seemingly getting everything he wanted, yet still lacking the confidence to admit his love for Miss Kubelik and stand up to Sheldrake. At this point, the keys become symbols for Baxter's strength of character, with the passing of his own key representing Baxter's willingness to sell his soul, while the key to the executive washroom represents the hollowness of what it was all for. This is finally paid off when Baxter is given an ultimatum. Let Sheldrake use his apartment once again, or throw away his job. So Baxter gives Sheldrake the key.
Now you're being bright.
And then, the payoff.
Say, Baxter, you gave me the wrong key.
No, I didn't.
But this is the key to the executive washroom.
That's right, Mr. Sheldrake. I won't be needing it because I'm all washed up around here.
Refusing to yield the key to his apartment is the ultimate act of self-defiance and reassertion of self, with Baxter finally achieving his self-confidence and reclaiming agency over his life. But the initial setup also has immediate consequences, with the mix-up of keys leading to Baxter being locked out in the freezing rain and getting a cold. This not only demonstrates Baxter's willingness to subordinate himself, but it also has a visceral effect on the character, with his cold being a persistent element in the next few scenes. The point is, this doesn't feel like a setup, but a natural consequence of the character's actions. As a result, the payoff serves as a delightful surprise which also makes intuitive sense. If you have a problem in the third act, the real problem is in the first act. This refers to the need for film stories to build, that in a conventional 3-act structure, everything which occurs within the third act should have some sort of precedent in the first. With that in mind, let's look at Act 3 of The Apartment and how its elements are first established in Act 1. First, we need to establish where the act breaks are in the film. Clearly defining an act can be a bit difficult, but 2 useful overriding trends is that each act has its own unique dramatic question, which adds to the overall tension of the film, and that an act ends when the protagonist makes a pivotal choice they can't turn back from. By that logic, the dramatic question of Act 1 is, will Baxter's self-sacrifice yield him what he wants? And the act ends when Miss Kubelik chooses to stay with Sheldrake, while Baxter goes to see the Music Man by himself. He's starting to get the advancement he wanted, but he's alone. The dramatic question of Act 2 is, what are the consequences of Baxter and Kubelik's choices? With Baxter moving further up the company ladder, but seeing the consequences of his choices when Miss Kubelik attempts suicide. The act ends with Miss Kubelik leaving the apartment and Baxter realizing that he loves her. In Act 3, both characters get what they thought they wanted. Baxter is promoted, and Sheldrake divorces his wife. The dramatic question becomes, will Baxter and Miss Kubelik give up what they thought they wanted to be with each other instead? Wilder and Diamond begin laying the pieces for this question in Act 1, which firmly distinguishes each character's want from their need, but also how pursuing their want only deepens their need. The first act also positions Sheldrake as the central antagonist, exploiting both Baxter and Miss Kubelik for his own gain. It's also crucial that Wilder and Diamond introduce Baxter and Kubelik's banter before revealing the affair, warming the audience to the notion of the two as a couple before placing obstacles in front of them. Finally, the first act also introduces Miss Olsen, whose actions will ultimately prompt Sheldrake's divorce in Act 3. All of the major elements which will define the drama and conflict of Act 3 are already being constructed in Act 1. Let the audience add up 2 plus 2, they'll love you forever. Wilder again credits this technique to Lubitsch, and it refers to how you deliver information to the audience. The principle of 2 plus 2 is that you don't simply tell the audience something, you give them the pieces to put it together for themselves. Consider, Sheldrake never actually asks to use Baxter's apartment. Instead, he at first grills Baxter for passing around the key, but as his interest grows, and he asks for ever more details, the audience starts to put together that Sheldrake wants to use the apartment for himself. Now, the audience gets the satisfaction of discovery, and it even creates some suspense, as they anticipate when Baxter will figure things out. Crow and Wilder specifically cite Baxter's discovery of Sheldrake and Kubelik's affair as an example of 2 plus 2. Baxter simply being told about the affair is not dramatically interesting. Instead, he discovers it for himself. Baxter finds a broken hand mirror in his apartment, and rightly assumes it belongs to Sheldrake's faceless mistress. He returns it to his boss, and the two share a laugh at the mistress's expense. Later, when Miss Kubelik loans her mirror to Baxter, he notices it's broken, and he adds 2 + 2. This creates a lot of dramatic irony, as Miss Kubelik doesn't know that Baxter knows about the affair, but the audience does. Moreover, Baxter's realization is not just that the woman he likes is being led along by this dickhead, but that Baxter has helped facilitate this affair. In a sense, he's responsible for her pain. Wilder and Diamond stressed this moments earlier, when the oblivious Baxter brags about his close friendship with Sheldrake and parades a Christmas card of Sheldrake with his wife and kids, clueless to the pain he's causing. But in this moment, Baxter suddenly realizes what he's done. These are the sort of dramatic possibilities which open up when you let character and audience add 2 + 2. In doing voiceovers, be careful not to describe what the audience is already seeing. Add to what they are seeing. Voiceover is one of the most contentious elements in screenwriting, but it's a device Wilder used all the time. His reasoning was simple. There's no shame in taking 12 seconds to express something in voiceover that'd take 12 minutes of dialogue. Sure enough, the only voiceover in the apartment is in the opening scene, to introduce the audience to Baxter, the basics of the film's setting, and the film's high concept. And even in this limited capacity, Wilder and Diamond are careful not to just describe things. Most importantly, Baxter never actually explains the situation with his apartment. Instead of describing what the audience is seeing, the voiceover asks questions.
It's not that I'm overly ambitious. It's just a way of killing time until it's all right for me to go home. You see, I have this little problem with my apartment. The only problem is I can't always get in when I want to.
These questions draw the audience into the film's high concept without having to explain it to them. The event that occurs at the second act curtain triggers the end of the movie. Going by our earlier act breakdown, Act 2 ends with Baxter taking a punch from Miss Kubelik's misinformed brother-in-law, Kubelik showing Baxter genuine affection before leaving his apartment, and Baxter solidifying his love for Miss Kubelik. This event triggers the end of the movie, with Miss Kubelik being free to choose what she wants for herself, and Baxter realizing he is willing to sacrifice certain comforts in order to do the right thing. And this is exactly what happens in Act 3. Baxter throws away his cushy job in defiance of Sheldrake's cruelty, and Miss Kubelik chooses to be with Baxter entirely of her own accord. Crucially though, while the second act should trigger the end of the movie, Wilder specifies that Act 3 still needs a twist of its own, and the apartment has such a twist, with Miss Olsen revealing Sheldrake's affair and Sheldrake's wife filing for divorce. With no marriage to maintain, Sheldrake is now much more interested in romancing Miss Kubelik, and this of course complicates the drama. We talked before about how Baxter and Miss Kubelik needed to defy Sheldrake for the sake of their character arcs, but Sheldrake's presence also heightens the narrative stakes. The dramatic question isn't just, will Baxter and Miss Kubelik get together, but are Baxter and Miss Kubelik willing to sacrifice what they wanted in order to be together? There are a lot more consequences to the second choice, and that makes the dramatic resolution all the more impactful. The third act must build in tempo and action until the last event, and then? You may have noticed my act breakdown is a little wonky in terms of time distribution, with Acts 1 and 2 being way longer than Act 3. Indeed, Act 3 only lasts 11 pages, but those 11 pages are some of the most densely plotted in the whole script. We can further break Act 3 down into 6 scenes, each of which has a substantial impact on the plot and characters. First, Baxter admits his love for Miss Kubelik. But then Sheldrake's divorce is revealed, so he can romance Kubelik while Baxter ascends yet higher in the company. Baxter and Kubelik meet, acknowledging they both got what they wanted, with Baxter taking his promotion and Kubelik slowly sliding into a relationship with Sheldrake. Though this victory is only bittersweet at best and openly melancholic at worst. But then, Baxter defies Sheldrake, throwing the job in his face and completing his character arc. We get some brief setup for the climax, then Miss Kubelik completing her arc, also represented by rejecting Sheldrake. With both arcs finally complete, Baxter and Miss Kubelik come together. This is incredibly lean screenwriting. In just 6 scenes, Wilder and Diamond fulfill the characters' wants while pushing them into yet more difficult choices to fulfill their needs, culminating in the completion of both character arcs, with each scene pushing the drama and characters further and further. This tightness stems in part from point 6, and how everything in Act 3 is set up well in advance, and that pays off in dividends here. Each scene builds until the final event. And then, that's it. Don't hang around. We're gonna step outside the apartment for a second and take a look at another Wilder classic, Double Indemnity. So, spoilers. Double Indemnity is a classic film noir, where a naive insurance agent, played once again by Wilder's perfect dickhead Fred McMurray, is duped into a murderous scheme by a femme fatale. The film ends with McMurray confessing to murder to his boss, and the implication that he'll be sent to the gas chamber. It's a perfectly understated end to McMurray's moral degradation and betrayal. But Wilder originally shot an additional scene where McMurray is executed, but over the course of filming, Wilder realized he didn't need it. The story was between the two men, and once their relationship has reached its endpoint,
Mulder, you're all washed up.
There's no reason to stick around. Make your point as simply and elegantly as you can, then take your bows. The same ethos informs the end of The Apartment. After Baxter and Miss Kubelik have fulfilled their needs and finally come together, there's really only one thing to say.
Shut up and deal.